Hey, welcome back to the South Stands, a Buckeye football podcast by Ohio State fans, for Ohio State fans. From the West Coast, I'm your host, Zach Moore. Today is Thursday, February 6, 2025, and thank you for joining me while I talk to myself about the first 2.5 weeks of an eventful 2025 offseason for your Ohio State Buckeyes. Folks, Ryan Day is experiencing what most head coaches must endure in the wake of winning a national championship, which is watching key cogs of his coaching staff depart for other opportunities. Offensive coordinator and quarterbacks coach Chip Kelly is now the offensive coordinator for the Las Vegas Raiders. He's making $6 million a year to do that. Defensive coordinator Jim Knowles accepted the same post at Penn State, which was a bit of a surprise to many of us when it happened. And offensive line coach Justin Fry has accepted the same position for the Arizona Cardinals. Now, the good news for Ohio State fans is 2 of those 3 vacancies have just been filled as of yesterday. Let's start with the man that Ryan Day just tabbed as Chip Kelly's successor in what was a highly anticipated move by many who cover the program. Brian Hartline has been elevated to offensive coordinator, replacing Kelly. Hartline had previously held the title of co-OC and receivers coach, but with this promotion, Hartline's responsibilities will actually include play calling duties. This is according to ESPN's Adam Rittenberg. It's not clear right now if Hartline will continue to coach the receivers or if Ryan Day will hire or elevate someone else to coach that position, but we'll see. You know, look, there really was no replacement for a play caller of Chip Kelly's stature and experience, unless someone like, Steve Sarkisian suddenly decided he didn't want to be a head coach anymore, like Chip Kelly did last year. But with a national title under his belt and the cachet that comes with it, Ryan Day can afford to take what I believe is a calculated risk on Brian Hartline. Hartline is entering his 8th season as a full-time coach. It's 9 if you count the year he spent as a GA. He has a lot of experience with Ryan Day, a lot of exposure to what Ryan Day likes to do on offense. Now, when he was promoted to co-offensive coordinator before the 2023 season, that was 2 years ago, it felt a little too soon for Hartline to take on any play calling duties. And ultimately, that seemed to be Ryan Day's view as well, because Day retained all of the play calling that season. But the timing seems right now to elevate Hartline. Let him take his lumps, and Ryan Day can always step in if things aren't going to plan. But, elevating Hartline, it just seems like the logical next step for the program. And promoting him also means keeping that pipeline of great receivers coming through Columbus. So there is that benefit as well. My usual lean here, though, is to go with an experienced coach. Someone like Joe Moorhead, the Akron head coach, who was reportedly one of Ryan Day's targets for this role. Moorhead, as we remember, was the architect of some really good offenses at Penn State in 2016 and 2017. He was also a successful OC at Oregon after that. I think Moorhead could have done some great things with the offensive skill talent on this roster. But look, Hartline has gone as far as he can go as a position coach. He's been on a meteoric rise as the country's best recruiter and developer of receiver talent for the last 5 or 6 years. It's time to find out what he can do as a coordinator in Columbus. I'd rather him do it in Columbus than somewhere else. And I think this is the right move right now. The timing is right. Billy Fessler, who was an analyst last season that worked very closely with the quarterbacks, has been elevated to quarterbacks coach, which was another void left by Chip Kelly. The 29-year-old Fessler was previously a quarterbacks coach both at UCLA under Kelly in 2023 and at Akron in 2022, so he does have some experience doing this. Will Howard said last week in his farewell video to fans, quote, "Billy Fessler is one of the guys that doesn't get a lot of credit. He did an unbelievable job developing me this year," end quote. So there you have it, an endorsement from Will Howard. That certainly doesn't hurt Fessler's case. Ryan Day has also reportedly found his man to replace Justin Fry in 35-year-old Tyler Bowen. Bowen was Virginia Tech's offensive coordinator and quarterbacks coach the last 2 seasons. He also spent 3 seasons at Penn State as their recruiting coordinator and tight ends coach. He also held the title of co-offensive coordinator at Penn State back in 2020. In Happy Valley, Bowen was the primary recruiter for Penn State greats like left tackle Olufashanu and tight end Tyler Warren. Now, that to me really stands out about Bowen's experience because, as we know, Justin Fry was not a great recruiter. That was one of his weaknesses. Bowen also spent one season in the NFL in 2021 as Urban Meyer's tight end coach in Jacksonville. And I wonder if that's how Bowen got onto Ryan Day's radar, with an endorsement from Meyer. Now, the knock on Bowen is that he's a little short on actual offensive line coaching experience. Bowen only has 2 seasons of experience as an O-line coach, one at Maryland in 2017 and another at Fordham in 2016. But he does bring experience as a former offensive lineman himself to the table. Bowen was an offensive lineman at the University of Maryland from 2007 to 2009. Bill Landis said on Subtext that Bowen makes a lot of sense as someone with offensive play calling experience who can also design a run game to pair with Brian Hartline. And Bowen is going to inherit what I believe to be a very good offensive line. Carson Hintzman, Luke Montgomery, Tegra Shabola, and Austin Sareveld, who all played extremely well during the playoffs, are going to give Bowen a very strong interior offensive line. Center Josh Padilla is also going to be a factor with that group. And then you have the additions of tackles Ethan Onyanwa and Philip Daniels at tackle from the transfer portal that I think are going to make an offensive line that could potentially be a Joe Moore Award finalist in 2025. I think that is totally within their sights. I'm really excited to watch Onyanwa this season. He looks like an absolute junkyard dog. I'm looking forward to breaking down the roster with Paige and Chad this offseason. We'll do that here in the coming weeks. But Onyanwa is a kid I'm really looking forward to watching. Now, Ryan Day we think, is still searching for Jim Knowles' replacement at defensive coordinator, or perhaps that man has already been identified and it just hasn't been announced yet. As we take stock of Jim Knowles' 3 years with the program, it has to start with the fact that Ohio State had inarguably the best defense in the country last season. Number 1 in total defense, number 1 in defensive yards per play, number 1 in scoring defense, number 1 in stop rate. And the Buckeyes were vastly improved, especially over the second half of the season and in the playoffs, at creating lost yardage plays. The Silver Bullets finished second nationally in sacks with 53 and fifth nationally in tackles for loss with 113. Those were the program's highest totals in sacks and tackles for loss since 2019. As Doug Lesmerises said, and I wholeheartedly agree, the Ohio State defense was the best unit, offense or defense, of any team in the playoffs this year. And I will always consider the 2024 National Championship a defense-driven title, much like the 2002 championship. And Jim Knowles, look, he deserves his flowers for all of that. Now, I think you also have to credit a group of veteran defensive players, 4th and 5th year guys that elevated their games in the postseason. Those kids played a lot of big games during their careers, and you got to give them credit for what Ohio State did last year. And also some supremely talented younger players, namely Caleb Downs and Sonny Styles. At the same time, we also have to weigh what happened after the October 12th loss at Oregon, a game in which the Buckeyes were torched by the Ducks for nearly 500 yards of offense and 32 points. And after that game, Ryan Day had to get involved with the defense for the first time since Knowles was hired 3 years ago. We remember when he was hired after that disastrous 2021 season for the defense, Day famously referred to Knowles as, quote, the head coach of the defense. And Knowles had been mostly left alone to design and run that unit his first 2 seasons in Columbus. But after the Buckeyes failed to pressure Dillon Gabriel in that October 12th loss, Day had to step in. The Buckeyes failed to sack Gabriel in that game. They only registered 2 tackles for loss, and Gabriel torched them for 341 passing yards in that game. And we also have to weigh the 2022 Michigan loss and the 2022 CFP semifinal loss to Georgia. Those are also part of the Jim Knowles story at Ohio State. The Buckeye defense gave up 87 points and 1,063 yards of total offense and a staggering number of explosive plays between those 2 games. Now, in the end, I think we can say the Jim Knowles experiment was a success because it ended with a national championship, but there were a lot of bumps along the way, and I think a reasonable argument can be made that the way Jim Knowles called the defense at the end of the 2022 season in the losses to Michigan and Georgia probably cost Ohio State a national title. I made that argument at the time, and I still believe it to this day. After taking a week to think about Knowles' departure, I'm good with it. I think it was time for both sides to move on. A lot had been made about, the mismatch of Knowles and defensive line coach Larry Johnson. There was a real feud there, reportedly. They had their differing views on what type of defensive front to deploy. Johnson wanted to use a 4-man front. Knowles, as we know, preferred a 3-man front with a stand-up jack. It was also reported by CBS Sports earlier this week that Knowles didn't take kindly to Ryan Day spending more time in defensive meetings after the Oregon loss. And there were rumblings that James Laurinaitis wanted to play more with 3 linebackers, and Knowles' scheme, as we know, is built on 2 linebackers with 3 safeties. It's also worth noting that Ohio State is bringing in a very strong crop of linebacker prospects with this year's recruiting class headlined by Riley Pettijohn. So just a lot going on there on the defensive side of the ball, and it was time for both parties to move on. Now, Ohio State should have plenty of viable options to replace Knowles, starting with safeties coach Matt Guerrieri, who is very familiar with Knowles' scheme and has some experience calling a defense. Guerrieri held the title of co-DC both at Indiana in 2023 and at Duke from 2018 to 2021. At the championship celebration in Ohio Stadium a couple weeks ago, Ryan Day spoke very highly of Guerrieri, calling him, quote, one of the brightest minds in college football and a star in the making, end quote. Now, there are also rumors that the Buckeyes could pursue Pitt defensive coordinator Randy Bates, who is an Ohio State alum. Bates has been the DC at Pitt since 2018. What most stands out to me, and probably many Ohio State fans, about Bates' defense at Pitt are the 5 interceptions of Kyle McCord in a 41-13 win over Syracuse last season. I think there were 3 pick sixes of McCord in that game. At the age of 64, Bates began his coaching career in 1982 at Muskingum. He also spent 12 seasons at Northwestern between 2006 and 2017 as a linebacker coach. According to Bucknuts, Kansas City Chiefs defensive line coach Joe Cullen is another name to watch. At 57-year-olds, Cullen has been in the NFL since 2010, almost exclusively as a defensive line coach, though he did spend the 2021 season as a defensive coordinator for, guess who, Urban Meyer in Jacksonville. So this is another guy that probably got onto Ryan Day's radar through Meyer. At this time last year, Cullen was reportedly courted by the Washington Commanders, Seattle Seahawks, and the University of Michigan for their defensive coordinator vacancies. So Cullen seems destined to be a defensive coordinator again at some point in the near future. Another name to watch is Indiana defensive coordinator Bryant Haynes. He has come up in connection with this search. Haynes was the architect of an excellent Hoosier defense last season that finished right behind Ohio State at number 2 nationally in total defense and defensive yards per play. The Hoosiers also led the country in rush defense. Haynes had followed Kirk Cignetti from JMU to Indiana last season. He spent most of his career coaching linebackers. Haynes is a really good DC, but I'd say only marginally more experienced than Matt Guerrieri. It seems like if you're going to make the youth hire, Guerrieri probably makes a little bit more sense, but Haynes is definitely a name to watch here in this search. I think it's going to be very interesting to see which direction Ryan Day will go with this hire. Does he elevate the rising star, 35-year-old Matt Guerrieri, who's only been in his current position for 1 season? Or does he bring in a more experienced coach from the outside, like Bates, like Cullen? Now, Guerrieri, we assume, would ensure some continuity with his familiarity of Jim Knowles' scheme, but Bates and Cullen are the far more experienced options. I mean, Bates, for example, has been calling defenses at the FBS level for 7 seasons. And I'm always going to gravitate toward experience when it comes to coordinators. But it's not as if Guerrieri lacks experience, it's just that Bates and Cullen have more. And my usual preference here in this situation is to go with a guy that has the most experience coordinating defenses at the highest level. But there does seem to be a lot of buzz about a co-DC designation for Matt Guerrieri and defensive backs coach Tim Walton. And I suppose I'd be okay with that. But my question, I guess, is are other teams beating down the doors of Guerrieri and Walton to come coordinate their defenses? Maybe they are. But I don't think either is a Brian Hartline situation, where they're bringing such tremendous value at the positions that they coach in terms of recruiting and development that the program can't afford to lose either of them, right? I mean, Guerrieri, again, has only been in his position for 1 year. I don't know what the market would be for Tim Walton as a defensive coordinator elsewhere. It seems to me like, Walton would be just fine remaining as a position coach. I really hope Ryan Day does a thorough search here and takes a good long look at candidates like Bates, Cullen, and Haynes and other external candidates before making a choice. If a thorough national search leads Day to deciding that Guerrieri and Walton are the best options as co-DCs, great. But I just really hope we don't get a repeat of what we saw in the latter days of Urban Meyer, which was, Meyer hiring guys who he was familiar with, but who were far from the best available options. If Matt Guerrieri is elevated to a coordinator role, we'd be looking at a significant youth movement within the coaching staff. 2 coordinators, both under the age of 40. Hartline's 38, Guerrieri's 35, and Day now has a 35-year-old offensive line coach and a 29-year-old quarterbacks coach. I think there's some risk there with that much youth and inexperience, especially with Hartline. And, it also stands to reason that Ryan Day is going to have to focus much more of his time and energy on offense in 2025 with a first-time coordinator and a 29-year-old quarterbacks coach than he did last year. And we talked a lot about the value of Day being able to step back and oversee the entire operation as the CEO of his program last season, because he had Chip Kelly handling the offense and coaching the quarterbacks. And he also, of course, had a very experienced defensive coordinator in Jim Knowles. Day had the bandwidth, for example, last year to get involved with the defense after the Oregon loss, which forced much needed positive change on that side of the ball. Probably saved Ohio State's season. It was a much needed course correction that Day was able to make happen because he had the bandwidth to do that. Will he have less bandwidth to get involved in other areas like the defense or special teams in 2025? I think that's an important question, given the youth on that in the coaching staff on that side of the ball. But, there also seems to be significant upside in Hartline and Guerrieri. And both coaches would certainly ensure valuable continuity, I think. And as I mentioned, Ryan Day is playing with some house money now with a national title under his belt. He can probably afford to take a calculated risk with some of these hires. Now, for the record, personally, I would prefer to see a veteran hire from the outside at defensive coordinator. Someone like Bates or Cullen. I think Day can still give Matt Guerrieri a co-DC title and get him more involved in designing the defense. But I much prefer the idea of a veteran coach like Bates or Cullen making those important decisions in the fog of war on game day. Okay, that's going to do it for me. Look for another podcast from Paige, Chad, and myself in the coming weeks. We're going to look at a whole bunch of stuff. We'll look at next year's schedule. We'll certainly look at the roster and position battles that'll be happening this offseason. So check your feeds for that podcast in the coming weeks. Until then, thanks so much for listening, and go Bucks. You've been listening to the South Stands, a Buckeye football podcast. Follow us on X at South_Stands.